Um, just as an FYI, your research papers have been graded. You should be able to see your feedback in Blackboard. Overall, you guys did a really good job on the paper, and I appreciate that. I know research papers aren't easy, so I appreciate the work you guys put into the papers. Today, we're going to finish talking about monetary policy. We're going to talk about taxes, spending, and we'll end with a discussion of our current tax system and its flawed issues. So last time we talked a bit about stimulus spending, the minimum wage, and so on. Right, so when we're talking about monetary economic policy, basically what we're talking about is regulating the economy by manipulating the supply of money and credit that is available. So the federal government tries to control how much money is in the system, how much credit is available, because you don't want it to be too easy to get a mortgage like we saw in 2008, but you don't want it to be impossible either. So we have the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed as it's commonly known, made up of 12 Federal Reserve banks located in major cities. And the Fed is the banks for bankers. They make the loans that banks take out. So basically, the Fed is the bank for the banks. And so they'll supply the currency and the coins. So you may have seen signs when you go into stores now saying there's a national coin shortage. Because people aren't out and about, the coins haven't been circulating as much, which is why businesses now prefer if you pay with exact change or if you use your debit card, because there's a shortage of coins in circulation right now. So the members of the Federal Reserve System Board cannot be fired during their term other than for cause. So the chair of the Fed is chosen by the president. During the Clinton administration, Alan Greenspan was chair of the Fed for most of his administration. There's a 7-member board that serves a 4-year term. And they're independent of the president. They control the interest rates. The president can try to persuade them, but he can't force them to do what he wants. So they're in charge of controlling interest rates, fighting inflation, and the buying and selling of government securities. So sometimes they'll raise the interest rates to put a cap on certain industries. Other times they'll keep the interest rates lower to stimulate demand. So they control the interest rates on federal loans. So if you've ever wondered why the interest rates go up, largely that's because of the Federal Reserve. They're trying to make sure the economy doesn't get thrown out of whack. Out of curiosity, have any of you taken an economics class yet? No? Okay. So some of this you'll learn a little bit more about if you do take an econ class. All right. So the federal government will invest in the economy. The FDIC insures bank deposits up to $250,000. The FDIC was created during the Great Depression. Part of the reason people lost their money during the Great Depression is banks were using deposit money to invest in the stock market. So when the stock market collapsed, people lost their savings. So the FDIC exists to protect us from losing our money if a bank collapses. So if the banking industry collapses, your money is still safe. You still have access to your checking and savings account. So all of us are protected by the FDIC. There's also the Department of Housing and Urban Development that insures home mortgages, tries to encourage banks to lower interest rates, and provides loans to groups like veterans, trying to give them special interest rates, special ability to get a loan. Unfortunately, if there's not enough control of the real estate and housing industries, then we get what we saw in 2008 when over 5 million homes were lost to foreclosure. People stopped being able to afford their high mortgage payments. Houses were overvalued. People were getting a mortgage on a house for $250,000 when the house was maybe only worth $175,000. So banks went out of business. Mortgage companies went out of business. Wall Street agencies were going out of business. So the Federal Reserve Board managed to keep one of the banks from going completely under. Bear Stearns was an investment bank very famous on Wall Street. If that bank had collapsed, the entire industry would have collapsed. So they arranged for JP Morgan Chase to buy out Bear Stearns so the housing and banking industry would not completely collapse. There were a couple of mortgage companies that did go out of business. Fannie and Freddie Mac no longer exist. They couldn't make it through the recession. So sometimes the Fed will step in and have one business buy out another so an industry doesn't collapse. So you don't have thousands of people out of work overnight. And they have provided $1.5 trillion in emergency loans to banks, largely during the recession so people could continue to get student loans, car loans, and occasionally buy a house. After 2008, it became a buyer's market. The number of houses for sale skyrocketed, so people could afford to be choosy. They could afford to take their time and look for a house because there was so much on the market that it was a lot harder to sell a house than it was to buy a house. So it became a buyer's market. And so they were trying to encourage people to buy these houses that were foreclosed on. And it didn't help the banking industry that their image took a hit after 2008 because people blamed them for the recession. So they had to release all these ads about how they were fixing things, making sure people got to stay in their homes. They took a little bit of a hit. All right, taxes. Taxes. Okay. Originally, the taxes were placed on goods like alcohol, tobacco, sugar, tea, and so on. It's a lot easier to collect taxes on goods that people buy every day. And then in 1913, with the passage of the 16th Amendment, we got our first national income tax. So it wasn't until 107 years ago that the federal government started taxing income as well as goods and property. And there's two different types of taxes that we tend to see: progressive and regressive. A progressive tax is where the rate of taxation goes up as your income increases. So the income tax is progressive. The more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. A regressive tax is basically a flat tax, and it hits lower income individuals harder because they pay a higher percentage of their income on this tax. Sales taxes are regressive. Here in Texas, you pay about 8.25% in sales tax. If you're making $10,000 a year, that's going to hit you a lot harder than if you're making $60,000 a year. Same with things like the Social Security tax. So some taxes hit lower income Americans harder. The gas tax. If you're not making a lot of money, that can have an impact on how often you're able to buy gasoline. So regressive taxes hit lower income Americans harder. And we've seen issues with the tax rates. In the 1960s, if people made over $200,000 a year, which is roughly the equivalent of almost $1 million today, they paid 91% in income taxes. Now it's dropped to about 39% for the highest tax bracket. We've also seen more loopholes created for businesses and individuals. Having bank accounts in countries like the Cayman Islands, so they don't report all of their income. Using various tax loopholes to reduce the amount of money they can be taxed on. And there's a lot of debate about tax cuts and their effectiveness. We tend to see Republican presidents wanting to cut taxes on the wealthy, and Democratic presidents wanting to cut taxes on middle and low income Americans. The argument made by Republicans is if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they'll spend the money and it will filter down through the economy. The argument made by Democrats is rich people don't need tax cuts, they're not going to spend the money, so you need to give it to people who are lower income. Any way you look at it, tax cuts do increase the size of the federal deficit because you've got less money coming in. So every time we cut taxes, there's less money coming into the federal government. So people don't necessarily like paying taxes, but we can't keep cutting taxes because we're going to run out of money if we do that. Okay, so it's not like there's an endless supply of money in the economy. At some point, there has to be a budget that is set. So the Office of Management and Budget is part of the executive branch, and they will create the president's budget. They will try to set the amount of money that each agency is given. So the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, the Department of Education, All of that comes from the Office of Management and Budget. And then you have the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, that helps to create the annual budget resolution that sets the amount of money given to agencies. Congress has to pass a budget bill or the government shuts down. So when we had the government shutdown at the end of 2018, that was because President Trump wanted more money in the budget for the border wall. Democrats said no. Neither side was willing to budge at first, so the government shut down. So it's critical that Congress creates a budget that is not going to be shot down by the president. Otherwise, the entire government has to shut down until they pass a spending bill. There have been times where we have a balanced budget. Unfortunately, because of the costs of wars and tax cuts, we are in a pretty large deficit. Our government is spending more money than it is taking in. So we have this disagreement between Democrats and Republicans over how to reduce the deficit. Republicans argue we should cut spending in welfare and education. Democrats say let's increase taxes on the wealthy and corporations. So the attempts to fix the budget deficit are largely dependent on who's in control of Congress and the White House. But no matter who's in charge, there are items that are not controlled by the regular budget process and are basically items you do not touch. So Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment benefits are mandatory spending. You have to fund Social Security and Medicare. They are entitlement programs. You do not touch them. So you can talk about cutting from this department and this department, but you don't touch Social Security. Okay, so the government does have some ability to regulate businesses and the economy. There is what's called antitrust policy. Essentially, the government can break up a monopoly. In the mid-1990s, Windows was in danger of being broken up into different companies because they were taking over the IT field. So if two companies want to merge, they have to get permission from the federal government. AT&T can't just buy out Sprint. Amazon can't just buy out Walmart. There are limits on the ability for companies to essentially buy each other up and limit the competition on the market. So the government will prosecute companies that try to create a monopoly. They can also require companies to make their accounting and business activities publicly available. We should know who's lobbying in Congress. We should know how well Amazon is actually doing, partly for stock investments. We should know if a company is actually doing well or not. Pfizer announced earlier this week that their vaccine is at about 92–93% effectiveness for COVID. So their stock is trading up because people are now investing in it, thinking that they may come up with a vaccine. There's another company that's sitting at about 94%, 95% effectiveness. These companies are going to see more investments because people are going to want to be on the ground floor of the COVID vaccine. So we are actually getting closer to a vaccine, and whoever invests in this company is probably going to do pretty well. We've also seen the creation of agencies like the Food and Drug Administration. Again, we don't want our food to be laced with E. coli. We don't want prescription drugs causing serious health problems. So there is more oversight in food and drug safety. Workplace safety, OSHA and others coming in to inspect construction sites and so on. Consumer product safety. Products that are defective need to be recalled as soon as possible. You don't need people getting behind the wheel of the car and having the car lose control completely because something's wrong with the ignition system. And we are seeing more protections somewhat for the environment. But we've also seen a push towards deregulation. The argument has been made that the economy isn't doing well because there's too much regulation of business. So some companies, some groups have been calling for less regulation instead of more, deregulating some of the environmental rules. We've seen less enforcement of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act compared to 10, 15 years ago. We've also seen a last-minute push from the Trump administration to approve permits to drill in ANWR, which is the Arctic Natural Wildlife Reserve in Alaska. So we're seeing a little less regulation in some areas and a push to deregulate even more. The government is also involved in subsidies and contracting. In terms of subsidies, the government can provide grants of cash for land to an individual or company. So we saw this happening in the 19th century when land was given to create the coast-to-coast railroad system. When there was the promotion of agriculture, the federal government does pay a lot of money in subsidies for farmers to protect them from years when they have a bad crop, make sure they're not going to go out of business. The government also sometimes gives a tax break to Amazon if they're building a new warehouse, or if a company builds a new bank, or sets up shop in another state. So corporate subsidies cost us about $100 billion every single year. The government can also get involved in contracting, setting the conditions for the sales of goods or services provided. The federal government does contract private prisons. We've seen an increase in the use of private prisons rather than state-run. They do save the state's money. The downside is, of course, there's less regulation of private prisons versus state-run. There's a lot of contracting in national defense. Defense companies come in to provide things like bulletproof vests, armor, and so on. Companies like Blackwater or Halliburton getting involved in the war efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq, spending a lot of money to provide the military with what they need. And concerns about defense spending were raised by President Eisenhower as he was leaving office. He was a former military general who warned against allowing defense companies to get involved in the military. He didn't want to see huge amounts of money being spent on national defense. So there was less spending, less contracting at the end of the Cold War, but then right after 9/11 there was a huge spike in defense spending again. Defense spending makes up the majority of our budget. We spend more on the military than the next 15 countries combined. So there's a huge amount of money to be made if you are a defense contractor. A lot of money and a lot of opportunity to get involved. And the problem with that is if you're using private contractors, you have less control over what they do. We've seen instances where Halliburton and Blackwater were doing things that were not even close to legal, but there's not much the government can do about that because they don't control these companies. All right, so in terms of how the environment plays into this, we had, of course, the passage of the Clean Water and the Clean Air Acts in the 1960s and 1970s. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland actually caught fire in 1969 because of the huge amounts of industrial pollution. There are some pretty creepy photos of the river on fire. I don't think anyone's jumping into that water anytime soon. So we had the first Earth Day in 1970. Obviously, we don't want rivers catching on fire. We want the water to be somewhat drinkable and people to be able to breathe. We are responsible for 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but we're only 10% of the global population. There have been attempts to try and fix the problems with the environment, but we haven't signed on to the Paris Accords. We backed out of the Kyoto Treaty, and there's a constant debate about climate change. 72% of Americans do believe the world is getting warmer, but less than half of Americans believe that humans are responsible for this. So we have members of the government who say climate change isn't real. And then you've got other people saying, well, if it's not real, then why have we had the most active hurricane season on record? We've already cycled through all of the names for hurricanes and tropical storms, and a new hurricane, Hurricane Zeta, just hit Central America as a Category 4 this late in November. Climate change is real. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. It's real, and we have to do something about it because we can't keep having these monster hurricanes coming in we're reaching the point where it's almost a point of no return. And there are legitimate concerns about how do we pay for more responsible energy use? How do we make changes so it's not extremely costly to consumers? We've seen the EPA wanting fuel standards on cars to be set at 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. This does mean that we will need to look at how do we increase fuel standards without increasing the cost to consumers. If we want all cars to have a high fuel efficiency, some of the cost of that is going to have to be passed on to consumers. So they're trying to balance fuel efficiency with reasonable car prices. We've also seen discussions about, well, let's increase the gas tax. Nobody wants to pay a gas tax. And if you increase the gas tax, you're still hurting low-income Americans because they still won't be able to afford to buy gasoline. So we are having problems with controlling and adapting to these environmental changes. Major droughts, the wildfires in California, hurricanes are all costly to the economy. But we can't seem to find a way to deal with them, to fix the problems that we're seeing. And to be perfectly blunt, we're just not doing enough to invest in alternate energy. We're not doing enough to break away from oil, to invest in solar or wind or thermal power. We haven't made a strong enough move towards more alternative energies. Okay, so what is the future of our economy? Well, the high rise in partisanship is keeping the government from actually discussing how to change the economy. Democrats say raise taxes, Republicans say cut spending. Neither side is willing to compromise as much anymore. You don't see as much bipartisanship between the two sides. And our economy is globally connected. We have a huge amount of trade with countries like India and China. Most of our jobs have been outsourced to India and China, so we can't afford to tick off the Chinese because then we're going to be in a world of hurt. We are more globally connected. We can buy products from all over the world. We can set up our own Etsy shop and ship products to Australia. So we are connected to the global economy. And a lot of American products are sent abroad. So we're part of a larger, globally connected economy, which is both good and bad. It's good because it's easier to get our goods and services abroad and vice versa. It's bad because we're almost over-reliant on China in terms of trade, manufacturing, and so on. And we are seeing an increase in the wealth gap. The middle class is shrinking, and the 1% is increasingly wealthy. We have the largest income gap of any developed nation. And there is an agreement that we need to fix the economy, but no agreement on how to do so. People don't like paying taxes, so if you suggest a tax raise, people start to panic. They don't like it. And we've seen a lot of people panicking over the proposed new tax system that President-elect Biden has suggested. Despite the fact that most people will not see their taxes increasing, people still don't like hearing the word tax increase. And we are seeing more economic policy being handled at the state and local level. Property taxes are not federal, they're state. Each state and local government sets the property tax rate. Sales tax is not national, it's created by the state and local governments. Spending on things like school districts, transportation, and so on are now largely state economic policies. So we're seeing a little bit of a shift away from federal regulation to state regulation. Because the federal government can't tell every state how to spend the money. All they can do is encourage them, but they can't necessarily tell Texas, you absolutely have to increase your amount of public transit. Okay, so I want to show you this chart of how tax rates have changed over time. From 1950 to about 1968, the 1%, give or take, paid about 91% in income tax. So the wealthiest Americans paid huge amounts of taxes. Currently, they pay about 35%. So we've seen an almost 60% decrease in the amount of taxes being paid by the wealthiest Americans. In terms of corporate taxes, they used to be as high as about 52%, give or take. Now it's sitting at 35%, assuming they don't find some kind of loophole that allows them to get out of paying taxes altogether. All right, so we've gone from 91% to 35%, 52% to maybe 35%. All right, so in terms of the current income tax rates, if you make a little less than $10,000 as an individual, you pay 10%. Here's where it gets complicated. If you're making between $40,000 and $85,000, you're paying 22%. If you're making over $500,000, you're only paying 37%. So even though you are making up to 10 times more than the people in this bracket, you're only paying 15% more in taxes. So what does this mean? It means that the tax burden is the highest on lower income Americans. It also is partly why we have the highest income gap in the world. So we've gone from 91% in income tax to 37% for the wealthiest. So if you've ever wondered why the income gap is as high as it is, it's because of our current tax system. In other countries, the wealthiest have to pay at least 50% in income taxes. They're only paying 37% here. All right, so let me ask you guys this. Does that seem fair to you? does this tax system seem equitable? And it was hard to read, but essentially the wealthiest Americans only pay 37% in income tax. Depends on how much they're making. So let's say you're making about what average Americans make, around $40,000 to $50,000. You're paying 22% in taxes. Yeah. Yeah. Most people fall somewhere between these two categories. You're paying between 22 and 24%, but they're only paying 37%. So again, does that seem reasonable? Not really. Okay. Yeah. Keeping in mind that in the 60s it used to be 91%, which is very high. I don't think we need to go back to that high. I mean, that was a lot. Yeah. Yeah, the wealthiest Americans used to pay 91% in income tax. We don't need to go that high again. Good Lord, that was high. But, I mean, closer to 50% might make sense. I mean, that's what they pay for the most part in European countries. Our tax rates are amongst the lowest in the developed world. Now, part of that is a trade-off. If you were living in Denmark, you would pay closer to 50% in income tax. The trade-off is you would have low college tuition, free healthcare, essentially, and a better environment for living in. There's a reason why throughout most of Europe, college tuition is basically like $2,000 or $3,000 a year, because they pay more in taxes and then they benefit from the taxes later. Whereas here we keep the taxes low, but then you have to pay more to go to college and things like that. So it is a trade-off. But I've seen a lot of discussion about the new Biden tax plan, which actually wouldn't hit anyone who makes less than $400,000 a year. So the majority of Americans would not see their taxes go up. Only the people who make about $400,000 or more would see a tax increase. And that's across the board, by the way. Everyone from liberal to conservative think tanks all agree that the majority of Americans will not see a tax increase. That most of us, our taxes may actually go down, not up, depending. So it's not likely that our taxes are going to go up. For the wealthy, if Biden is able to get this plan introduced, then they may see a tax increase. But for most of us, the incoming administration is not going to raise our taxes. And I know it's scary to think about because nobody likes to pay more taxes, but most of us should be fine. Emphasis on should. How many of you hate paying taxes? Or like, I'd rather just keep my money, thank you very much. Yeah, yeah. Nobody likes paying taxes. They're not exactly fun, right? Well, and it also depends on the state you're living in. Like here in Texas, we don't have a state income tax. When I lived in Massachusetts, I had to pay federal income tax, federal Social Security, federal Medicare. Then I also have to pay Massachusetts state income tax, Massachusetts Social Security, and Massachusetts Medicare.
But we do pay way more over there.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the more you make, the more you...
Yes and no. Cities like Boston, they have to pay you more because the cost of living is higher. Because a one-bedroom apartment starts at like $1,500 a month. Yeah, yeah. And so in those states, you have to pay federal and state taxes, and you have to do two tax returns. You have to do the federal, and then you have to do the state. So yeah, in those states where there's a state income tax, you have to pay both. And for some people, that does cut into their budget a bit, because there's a bit less money that you have up front compared to states like Texas, where there's no state income tax. But yeah, in states like Massachusetts, you have to pay both. You get your paycheck and you see the deductions for both sets of taxes, then you have to file 2 sets of tax returns at the beginning of every year and hope you get some money back. And it can, that can be painful for people who aren't making a lot of money. You really can't live in a city like Boston unless you're making at least 35 to 40,000 a year. If you're making less than that, you're not going to have much money at the end of the day. So the plus side of the state income tax is the states do have more money to spend. Texas, because we don't have a state income tax, we do rely on property taxes and sales tax. So in a state like Massachusetts, property taxes are actually lower compared to Texas because they pay a state income tax. And their sales tax is generally a bit lower because they pay a state income tax. So it's a trade-off. You're either going to pay through income tax or you're going to pay when you go out and spend money. Have any of you lived outside of Texas? No? Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's only a handful of states that don't charge a state income tax. Florida, Texas, Nevada, and like 1 or 2 others. Most states you do have to pay both. So you have to file 2 tax returns. If I put you in charge of the economy, what would you do to try and fix the current system? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious what you would do if someone was like, hey, now you're in charge of the economy, figure it out. I would start by getting rid of some of the loopholes that companies can take advantage of. Sending their money abroad so they don't have to pay taxes, things like that. I would try to close that loophole and say you have to report all of your income, and I don't care what country it's in, you're paying taxes here. If you're based in the United States, you should be paying taxes here. Because Jeff Bezos is on track to become the first trillionaire in history because of Amazon. Believe it or not. Yeah. Even after his divorce, he was still worth something like $800 billion, even after giving like part of the company to his ex-wife. I know, it's crazy to think about, isn't it? The fact that we could have the first individual person become a trillionaire. He's worth more than dozens of countries have in terms of their entire budget. And we do have some billionaires who are trying to fix the problem, like not Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have actually said, please increase our taxes. We want to pay more. And they do donate money, here and there. They set up foundations. So there are some billionaires who are like, yeah, this isn't fair. Like, we didn't make our money on our own, right? We all helped invest in Amazon. If tomorrow we all stopped buying product from Amazon, that would be the end of it, right? It's consumer driven. So part of the argument you can make is, well, if Amazon has made its money from us, why isn't Amazon returning the favor and reinvesting into the economy, right? Why aren't they paying their fair share in taxes to keep this country going? Like, we helped Amazon become what it is today. Why aren't they helping to pay for our investment? So taxes are complicated. The economy is incredibly complicated. And I'll tell you right now, there are people with masters and PhDs in economics who have absolutely no idea what the economy will look like in a year. 2019, the economy was doing very well. And then, of course, we had this global pandemic that nobody saw coming. So I have no idea what the economy is going to be like next year. If a vaccine is perfected and it's rolled out no later than maybe April, we could probably have a pretty good economic year. If we have to shut down the country again, it's going to get bad. Maybe, because the death toll is going back up again. And you can't blame people for wanting to get together, you really can't. But this is one of those years where maybe it's just better at home.
Yeah, my mom, especially speaking on my dad's side, we would go have some food with them, and I don't think they'd be able to go with grandma and like go with the nurse back home.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna go see my family in San Antonio for the holidays, but my little sister lives in California, and she's not getting on a plane. She's like, I don't trust my fellow passengers. I don't want to bring COVID with me,
Yeah.
so she's not coming home. And I think that's gonna be the case for a lot of people. They have to weigh the pros and cons of, do I get on a plane or not? I know President-elect Biden doesn't want to shut down the economy or shut down the country again. He does not. It's going to be incredibly unpopular. It would be a question of whether or not he even has the power to do so. And people are sick of having to stay home, right? People are fed up with having to stay home, not going anywhere. If he can avoid it, I think he doesn't want to shut down the country, but we may not have a choice. It's going to depend on how well-behaved people are over the holidays. If people are smart and we don't have more than like immediate family gatherings and things like that, we might be okay. But if people get stupid and they're like, let's have a party with 50 people at our house, we're going to be in trouble. It's just going to depend. I mean, I honestly don't know. I think it's entirely possible we may have another shutdown. California started again, and I cannot remember the other state, but most of Europe is now back in lockdown because of the second wave they've seen coming. So it's gotten colder, and people's immune systems take a hit when it gets colder, and yeah. We're lucky in one sense down here that we don't get usually super, super cold weather, so we might not get hit as hard, but states like Massachusetts and others where now it's like 15 degrees outside, they're in a little bit of trouble, yeah.
So that when it first COVID, like, was at the same time, you weren't hit,
No.
Eventually we got hit with that.
Yeah. And part of that was because the county itself shut down before the state of Texas did. We actually had the first lockdowns of any counties in Texas, the first masks mandates and everything. So we were actually keeping the numbers down here until the governor lifted the order here and people started going out without the masks, and then we got hit. So people were actually being pretty good here. But then when the governor lifted the mask mandate, I mean, people are going to do what they're going to do. So. But El Paso right now has a very high COVID rate. They've actually moved the mobile morgues over to El Paso right now. Yeah, it's scary, but we are getting closer on a vaccine. Those two in the United States that hit about 94–95% effectiveness, we're getting a lot closer. So fingers crossed for February, March next year, maybe we'll actually have a vaccine. The other problem, and the other problem is, I don't know, vaccines used to be mandatory in the United States. Everyone had to get vaccinated as a child, period, end of sentence. now with the whole myth about vaccines and autism, we've seen less people vaccinating their children. So then the question is going to become, can we force people to get a COVID vaccine? Maybe schools can enforce it, like if you go to college, if you're going to live in a dorm, you have to get a meningitis vaccine. Maybe we could enforce it for schools. But there are going to be people who are not going to want to take the vaccine. Yeah. Some of them are. There was a false study that was done in the mid-90s that linked vaccines to autism. There's absolutely no scientific link between vaccines and autism. Vaccines do not cause autism. If people get concerned about the ingredients in vaccines like mercury, but mercury is a preservative. You have to have it to keep the vaccine stable. You've got these people who try to claim vaccines are dangerous, but it's less than 1% of people who have an adverse reaction. I understand the parents who can't vaccinate their kids because their kids are immunocompromised or allergic to an ingredient in the vaccine. I have no problem with that. But I think we do need to go back to telling parents, you're going to vaccinate your kids or else. We're not going to put up with this nonsense anymore, because we don't need polio coming back. We don't need smallpox coming back. Measles is already back. We don't need this crap. Just freaking vaccinate them. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's harder to control in a high school because you've got all these kids in the hallways, you've got all these kids in the classrooms. It's on a college campus, it is easier because you can control the flow of traffic. It's a little bit easier, especially here because we don't have dorms. Yeah, high schools, I mean, you can't even control the common cold in a high school. How are you going to control? Jeez. Mm-hmm. How many students were in your graduating class? 500. Okay, yeah, that is a big high school. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. Yeah, and that's going to be the problem. I think they may have to make the vaccine mandatory if you want to send your kid back to school. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the only way I don't think we'll ever go back to fully normal again, approaching normal. That's the only way we could do it, is to basically make it mandatory and say, if you're not going to vaccinate your kids, then they have to stay home. I think maybe they'll make masks mandatory for maybe up to like 6 months, and then if we stop seeing new cases and we stop seeing deaths, then they'll probably lift the mandate. I think what we'll see happen though is if people get vaccinated, they will start allowing like full classes and stuff again, but you'll still have to wear a mask or something. But yeah, I mean, I think we'll still have to wear a mask until we're like 90% certain that the new cases are down into like single digits or something, and then maybe at that point you might be like, okay. But we'll still probably be wearing masks a year from now, in all likelihood. Yeah.
Yeah, some of us they sit there and he's doing like an activity like I had this time I was sitting there with his wife, dad passed away for something from his wife, and like oh he wants to go with us to the deal with COVID, and like really bad, like there was COVID really bad.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, for statistical purposes, it does help to know, did this person have COVID or not? But yeah, I mean, there is that line between, could this be COVID related or not? How do we prove it? Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky.
And then also like if someone died of COVID, they were not allowed to like release the body to the family or something like that.
Well, one of my deals after COVID, they allowed the union, but they have to do it so many days after the body.
My friend, his grandpa died,
Mm-hmm.
he was back then he had like open heart surgery, so I was like able to see the graft, but then the doctor, the hospital said it was too COVID, and they released the body like the next day, and they had a whole funeral and everything.
So like ours was like a deal, they released the body after a couple, like I think after a week.
Mm-hmm.
After a week, they allowed the viewing
Mm-hmm.
for the body, but afterwards they wanted just always wanted to do it, so they cremated it.
Yeah, I know what they're doing is social distancing, and it's pretty much limited to immediate family or family in the area only. So most people are postponing a memorial service until later. They're just doing like immediate family only, and then when it's safe to gather again, they'll try to do a memorial service. So there's going to be a lot of delayed memorial services for people.
Yeah, because you had like a whole funeral, and then like this yacht for like a little webcam, so like if you want to watch virtually, but there were still people that you have to mask and stuff. I read that what they were doing is that they're taking the body to like a big cooler and taking it away like to burn them or something like that.
I have no idea. I know COVID patients are being buried, but honestly, from a health standpoint, it is safer if people are being cremated.
Yeah.
But I don't know how it's tricky with the burials, but I think people are still being buried. It's just very tricky. They ran into that problem in West Africa with the Ebola cases. People were handling the bodies, but Ebola is contagious through handling an infected person's fluids like blood or sweat or anything like that. So people were handling the bodies and then they were getting sick. So then basically what they started doing was family members weren't allowed to handle the bodies. Healthcare workers had to go in and just bury them very, very quickly.
Also, my cousin, she worked for HBO, she worked for TV, and they're paying them for the COVID tested. So she wanted to then get a dog swab, and they came back positive. So she waited like 2 days, she went back to get the nose swab, and then came back negative.
Yeah, there have been some false positives. And there's also been some false negatives. The test is not 100% foolproof. Yeah, yeah.
They said to make the blood test out and like.
But the one was like, did you have it before?
Yeah.
That one is just positive, even your first step, then your first step positive, but it was a negative, and they recommend you still go get tested for the next.
Yeah.
So the very first time, like during the pandemic, we went to go get our food or so, and come back negative and stuff. That's kind of weird. I thought you guys would get the nose.
Yeah.
And then like later on, we go get nose swab.
Yeah. I think the nasal swab is more effective. I also know that what they're trying to do is someone who has survived COVID, they're trying to get plasma from them to treat current COVID patients, which I think is actually very smart. Yeah, yeah, as much as they can. Because that's one way to try and help, because if you've got the antibodies to fight it off, maybe you can help someone else. All right, we're going to talk about social policy on Thursday. I'll see you guys in class next Tuesday. If you came in late, come see me for attendance. Otherwise, I'll see you guys